Today, I want to take a look at the Swizzle Node, and this is something that we can apply to any function. And what it does is it allows us to pull out the required bits of information from one type of node and apply it to something else inside a function. And there's a ton of different usages for this. But I thought for this exercise, it'd be kind of fun to use a single float 4 input to drive a bunch of different nodes. And it'll allow us to take a look at how this swizzle works and give you an idea of all the various ways that you can apply it. And it's certainly not limited to doing this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an input parameter, and we're going to call it image, and we're going to make it a float 4. And what we're going to do is we're going to just give a variety of instructions that we can use to manipulate these little bitmaps here. And we'll make labels. The first thing we're going to make is the image number. So we're going to create an integer that's going to choose which one of these images we're going to use for our final result here. The next label I'm going to make is hue, because we're going to apply some colors to these things, and then we're going to be able to change that color. And the last two we're going to have as offset X and offset Y. And if we look at this in our preview, we just have this single thing here. And each one of these float values is actually talking about a different thing. It's not all dealing with a single float 4. And this is where the Swizzle node comes in, because we're going to create a series of 3 functions that are going to pull out the required information from this float 4. Let's start at the top and move down to the bottom. First thing, we're going to need to create an integer that will drive our switch. So I'm going to get a multi-switch grayscale, because I'm dealing with grayscales. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 inputs. And because it's a multi-switch, it'll allow us to designate the number of inputs that we're going to have in here. So we'll put 4. And then we can hook them up. And our input selection is what chooses which image we want. So how do we get a float 4 to drive this integer 1 value? Because it's telling us it wants an integer 1. First of all, let's grab our float 4. And if we come back in here, we'll see that our image number corresponds to the X value, because it goes X, Y, Z, W. And those are the official values here. So what we've labeled as image number is X. I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to swizzle out. I only need that X, so I'm going to swizzle out a float 1. And if I've got my Swizzle node highlighted and I come into the information, it's only got one option, and that's X. So this is what it's putting out, an X. But I can assign a value to that X from here. So I have the selection of assigning any one of those float 4s into this X value. As it turns out, I'm going to stick with X. So I've pulled out the correct slider, if you will, from here. It's a float 1, and we've just segregated out that float 1. And I'm going to be using it as an integer. So we're going to need to cast that to an integer, and that's going to change the type of information it is. So as it's sliding through the whole numbers, in other words, an integer is a whole number, so it'll start at 0, then at 0 point whatever, until it gets to the number 1, and then it'll go through all those decimals again until it gets to number 2, etc. And this integer value is only going to read whatever that whole number is. However, if we come back here and we take a close look at our multi-switch, we'll see that there is no input 0 here. It starts with number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. But the way our slider is set up is currently it's going from 0 to 1. Now, that's not going to work at all. There's a couple of things we're going to need to do here. I'm going to create a maximum of 3. And here's why we don't need 4. If we set our default value on this, we're only talking about this first slider here right now. If we set this default value to 0, and we work through the whole numbers here, we actually have 4 numbers. We have 0, 1, 2, and 3. We need to switch that so it runs from 1 to 4 instead of 0 to 3. Otherwise, while we're sliding through 0 through 2, it's going to read as 1. And this is an easy fix because all we need to do is add the number 1 to whatever is coming out of this slider. And that's going to convert this x value. It's going to, instead of starting at 0, it's going to start at 1, and then it's going to work its way up to 4 instead of 0 to 3. And we can come and take a look at our slider. It's currently at 0 plus 1. And we're sliding through this stuff. We're sliding through it until we hit the number 1. And it switches to the second one because now it's 1 plus 1. That's our last one. And we can, as we cruise through those whole numbers, it's going to switch that image. The next thing on our little list here is the hue. And to do that, we're actually going to have to make some colors here. So I'm going to get a gradient map. I'm going to plug this in. I'm going to double click on my gradient editor. And I'm going to get into the actual gradient here. And I'm just going to assign some colors. Actually, let's leave this one black and assign a color up here. And there's really no point in doing anything other than these two colors because there's absolutely no grayscale values in here. But what this is going to do is whatever this white area is will be this red color. And next I'm going to bring down this Hue Saturation Lightness node, and we can now change the hue of this to any other color we want. So just by having any color in here, it'll let you scroll through all the colors. And let's take a look at how this hue slider is actually working. At 0, it's our original color. At 0.5, it's our original color. And then at 1, it scrolls back to our original color. Because we created this switch here in the beginning, and we actually need to have 3 as our maximum. Because we're using a float 4, this is going to apply to all our float values. And that's okay. Because all it means is that we have to adjust them so that they scroll smoothly between 1 and 3 instead of 0 and 1. I'm sorry, they scroll smoothly between 0 and 3 rather than 0 and 1. And that's just math. So we'll create an empty function. We'll get in here. Again, let's get our float 4. And we'll get another swizzle. And again, we're going to swizzle out a float 1 because we're just dealing with that hue saturation. Only now we want the Y value because that's number 2. So I'm going to click on my Swizzle node and I'm going to assign that Y value to this X. And if we were just going 0 to 1, that'd be it. But we're not. We want to take it and slow it down. Because instead of moving from 0 to 1, we want it moving from 0 to 3, and that means we're going to need to divide it by 3. And that's just going to slow that slider down by 1/3. But it'll do exactly the same thing. So now we're talking about this slider. And 3 is our maximum. So at 0, at the beginning spot, it's our original color. In the middle, which is 1.5, it's our original color. And at the end of the scale, it's still our original color. And that means it's doing exactly the same movement it was doing before, only it's just doing it a little bit slower. And I'm going to set the default here at 1.5, which corresponds to the 0.5 default it has when you clear it out. And finally, these last 2, we're going to create an offset with those. And we know how to do that. We'll just hook this up to a transform 2D. And we can now get in here and create an empty function. Let's grab our float 4. But now, instead of a float 1, we're going to need a float 2. So we're going to swizzle out 2. And you can swizzle, I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's like super useful. You can use it in a bunch of different ways. And you can swizzle out all the way up to 4 floats. And again, we're going to do the same thing here. We've got our X, we're going to assign to Z, and our Y, we're going to assign to W. Just like the other one, because we've changed the size of the slider, for lack of a better word, we're going to take all of this, and we're going to divide it by 3. Oh, except it's a float 2. So my constant needs to be a float 2. And that's it. We've got everything hooked up to this one single parameter here. And the parameter has all the sliders we need. And we can do all the stuff we want to do to this just by using this one float 4 value. So that's it for this week. I got a lot on my plate, so I had to keep the video short. But I think this is actually pretty useful because it can be applied to a bunch of different stuff. And it lets you get tricky and move information around in a much more efficient way.